The biting wind, a relentless sculptor of the desolate plains, tore at the tattered edges of Amelia's shawl, whipping strands of her dark hair across a face already etched with the stark lines of grief. Her breath plumed in frosty clouds, each exhalation a visible testament to the cold that permeated her bones, a cold that mirrored the one in her heart. 3 days had passed since the earth had swallowed her last hope, her small son, leaving her adrift in a world suddenly devoid of color or purpose. The wagon, a skeletal frame against the vast, indifferent sky, was all that remained of her life in the East, a life she'd fled, chasing a phantom promise of prosperity in the untamed West, only to find it a brutal, unforgiving mistress. Dust, fine and omnipresent, clung to everything, a shroud over memory, a testament to the ceaseless, grinding hardship. Her fingers, chapped and raw, tightened around the worn leather straps of her satchel, the only possession she truly valued, containing a handful of faded letters and a tarnished locket. The sun, a pale, anemic disk, offered no warmth, only a stark illumination of the endless horizon, a line that promised nothing but more emptiness. Every creak of the wagon wheel, every whisper of the wind, seemed to echo the silence of her son's absence, a silence that was a physical weight in her chest. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The last of her meager coin had bought her passage this far, to the edge of a territory as wild and untamed as her own despair. The nearest settlement, a collection of ramshackle buildings clinging precariously to the banks of a shallow river, was still a day's journey, a journey she wasn't sure she had the strength to make. Her gaze, unfocused and distant, swept across the barren landscape, a panorama of harsh beauty and unforgiving reality. This land, she knew, did not suffer weakness lightly. It demanded resilience, a hardened spirit, qualities she feared had been leached from her by sorrow. The wind howled, a mournful lament, and Amelia pulled her shawl tighter, a futile gesture against the encroaching chill, both external and internal. She was a ghost in a desolate land, a whisper carried on the wind, with nothing left but the gnawing ache of loss and the chilling certainty that her world had irrevocably shattered. A figure, indistinct against the fading light, emerged from the distant shimmer of a heat haze, growing steadily larger, its outline sharpening into that of a man on horseback. He rode with a peculiar, almost languid grace, as if the horse were an extension of his will, effortlessly navigating the uneven terrain. As he drew closer, Amelia could discern the broad brim of his hat, pulled low, obscuring his features, and the powerful, almost intimidating breadth of his shoulders. He was a silhouette of quiet strength, a stark contrast to her own fragile form. He did not call out, did not offer a greeting, merely brought his horse to a halt a respectful distance from her, the animal snorting softly, its breath misting in the cool air. The silence that stretched between them was not uncomfortable, but rather charged with an unspoken understanding, a recognition of the vastness of the land and the smallness of human endeavor within it. Amelia, accustomed to the boisterous, often intrusive nature of men, found his quiet presence disarming, almost reassuring. He dismounted, his movements economical and precise, the jingle of spurs the only sound. He was tall, lean, with the weathered hands of a man who had known hardship. His face, when he finally lifted his head, was chiseled, framed by dark, unruly hair, and his eyes, a startling shade of blue, held a depth she couldn't quite fathom. They held no pity, no judgment, only a quiet assessment. He surveyed her, then the broken wagon, his gaze lingering on the crude cross she had fashioned for her son's grave, a testament to a life tragically cut short. He spoke then, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle. "Lost your way." It was not a question of direction, but of circumstance, an acknowledgment of her visible distress. Amelia, her throat tight with unshed tears, could only nod, her voice caught somewhere between her heart and her lips. He waited, patiently, his gaze unwavering, and in that silent vigil, a fragile thread of something akin to trust began to form in Amelia's shattered heart. He was an enigma, this man of the plains, but his quiet strength offered a strange, unexpected comfort in her desolation. His name, he eventually revealed, was Elias Thorne. He offered no further explanation, no details of his past, and Amelia, too weary for questions, accepted his quiet presence as a lifeline. He didn't offer empty platitudes or force sympathy, but instead began, without a word, to methodically assess the damage to her wagon. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with unpracticed efficiency, examining the broken axle, the splintered wood. He worked with a quiet determination, his focus absolute, as if the task were the only thing that mattered in the vast, indifferent landscape. Amelia watched him, a strange mix of gratitude and unease stirring within her. He was a man of action, not words, and his competence was a stark contrast to her own helplessness. He seemed to embody the very spirit of this land, unyielding, resourceful, and profoundly solitary. As he worked, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, casting long, dramatic shadows across the plains. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, a mournful sigh through the dry grasses. Elias, sensing her shivering, paused his work. Without a word, he retrieved a thick, wool blanket from his saddlebag and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth, though physical, felt like a caress, a small act of kindness in a world that had offered her little but cruelty. He then built a small, efficient fire, the flames licking at the dry brush, casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. He shared his meager provisions, dried jerky and a hard biscuit, without fanfare, pushing the food towards her, his gaze steady. "You'll need your strength," he murmured, his voice rough but not unkind. Amelia ate slowly, each bite a struggle, but the warmth of the fire, the rough comfort of the blanket, and the quiet, unwavering presence of Elias began to thaw the ice around her heart, however imperceptibly. He was not a savior, not a knight in shining armor, but a quiet, capable man who offered practical help, and in that there was a profound dignity. The journey with Elias was a study in stark contrasts. Days were spent in near silence, the only sounds the creak of the mended wagon, the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves, and the incessant whisper of the wind. Elias rode ahead, a silent sentinel, occasionally casting a glance back to ensure Amelia was faring well. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped, practical instructions about the terrain or the weather. Yet, in his reticence, Amelia found a strange comfort. There was no demand for conversation, no expectation of shared grief, only the quiet, unwavering presence of a man who understood the language of survival. At night, gathered around the small, flickering fire, the silence deepened. Amelia would watch him, illuminated by the dancing flames, his profile etched against the vast, star-strewn sky. He would sit, often whittling a piece of wood, his hands deft and precise, his gaze lost in the embers. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes would narrow when he scanned the horizon. He was perpetually alert, a creature of the wild, always attuned to the unseen dangers of the land. He never pressed her about her past, never asked about her son, but his quiet understanding was a palpable presence. One evening, as the moon cast long, ghostly shadows across the desert, Amelia found herself speaking, her voice a fragile whisper against the vast silence. She spoke of her son, of his laughter, of the dreams she had held for him, of the crushing weight of his absence. Elias listened, his gaze fixed on the fire, his face unreadable. He did not interrupt, did not offer platitudes. When she finished, her voice hoarse with emotion, he simply reached out and placed a small, smooth river stone in her palm. "For strength," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, and in that simple gesture, a bond, unspoken yet profound, began to form between them, forged in the crucible of shared solitude and quiet understanding. Their destination, when it finally emerged from the vast, undulating landscape, was not the ramshackle settlement Amelia had anticipated, but something far more grand, and utterly out of place. Nestled in a secluded valley, protected by a stand of ancient cottonwoods, stood a mansion. It was a sprawling edifice of stone and dark wood, its architecture a curious blend of frontier practicality and European elegance, with tall, arched windows and an imposing, heavy oak door. It seemed to defy the very nature of the wild, a testament to immense wealth and a singular vision. Amelia stared, her jaw slack with disbelief. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Elias, his gaze fixed on the mansion, offered no immediate explanation. His silence was not evasive, but rather contemplative, as if he too were still processing the reality of it. He dismounted, his movement slower, more deliberate than usual, a subtle tension in his broad shoulders. "It's mine," he finally said, his voice flat, devoid of pride or possessiveness. "I bought it." The words hung in the air, a stark declaration. A millionaire cowboy. The concept was as alien to Amelia as the mansion itself. She had envisioned a humble cabin, a working ranch, not this opulent, anachronistic structure. As they approached, a sense of unease began to settle over Amelia. The mansion, for all its grandeur, exuded a peculiar stillness, an almost oppressive quiet. The windows, dark and unblinking, seemed to watch them, and the air, even outside, felt heavy, as if holding its breath. There was no sign of life, no smoke from a chimney, no sound of activity. It was a monument to solitude, a grand, silent sentinel in the wilderness. Elias led her to the front door, his hand reaching for the heavy iron knocker, then hesitating. He turned to her, his blue eyes holding a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, apprehension, perhaps, or a deep-seated weariness. "It's not what you'd expect," he warned, his voice low, a prelude to an unspoken history. The heavy oak door swung inward with a groan that echoed through the silence of the mansion, a sound that seemed to awaken the dormant shadows within. The air inside was cold, stagnant, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something indefinable, a lingering presence that prickled the hairs on Amelia's arms. Elias stepped inside, his hand resting on the hilt of the pistol at his hip, his gaze sweeping the vast, dimly lit foyer. The mansion, even in its opulence, felt desolate, as if life had been abruptly sucked from its grand halls. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the faded grandeur of a once magnificent home. Ornate furniture, draped in white sheets, stood like silent ghosts, their shapes distorted and unsettling. A grand staircase, its banister intricately carved, spiraled upwards into the gloom, disappearing into the shadows of the upper floors. Amelia followed him, her footsteps tentative on the polished marble floor, each echo amplifying the oppressive silence. A chill, more profound than the external cold, seeped into her bones. This was not merely an empty house, it felt like a tomb. Elias moved with a quiet intensity, his senses heightened, his posture rigid. He led her through a labyrinth of rooms, a formal dining hall with a massive, dust-shrouded table, a library lined with countless, untouched books, their spines faded and neglected. Each room held the same sense of suspended animation, of lives interrupted, of a story unfinished. As they reached the central hall, a gasp caught in Amelia's throat, a sound of pure horror. Hanging from the grand chandelier, silhouetted against the weak light from a tall window, was the figure of a young woman. Her dark hair, braided with feathers, fell over her shoulders, and her eyes, wide and unseeing, stared into the void. She was dressed in traditional Apache attire, and her still form swayed almost imperceptibly in the stale air. A crude, frayed rope was knotted around her neck. The sight was a brutal, visceral shock, a punch to the gut. Elias, his face a mask of grim determination, his jaw tight, had already seen it. His hand dropped from his pistol, a silent acknowledgement of the tragedy, and his blue eyes, usually so unreadable, now held a deep, profound sorrow. The silence of the mansion was shattered, not by a sound, but by the sheer, overwhelming weight of the atrocity hanging before them. The horror of the discovery was a raw, gaping wound in the mansion's oppressive silence. Amelia stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend the macabre tableau before her. The young Apache woman, so cruelly dispatched, was a stark, brutal testament to the dark underbelly of this wild land, a chilling reminder of the violence that lurked beneath its rugged beauty. Elias, his face a grim mask, moved first. He approached the hanging figure with a solemn reverence, his eyes scanning the scene with a practiced, almost professional intensity. He did not touch her, but circled the body slowly, his gaze taking in every detail, the frayed rope, the undisturbed dust on the floor beneath her, the absence of any struggle. His movements were deliberate, his silence profound. Amelia, her initial shock slowly giving way to a sickening wave of grief and anger, found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. Who would do such a thing?" she breathed, the question aching with a terrible helplessness. Elias finally turned to her, his blue eyes, usually so guarded, now clouded with a deep, unsettling sorrow. "A monster," he said, his voice a low, guttural rumble, infused with a cold, controlled fury. "And one who thought he wouldn't be found." He then began the grim task of lowering the body, his movements gentle, respectful. He handled her with a tenderness that surprised Amelia, a stark contrast to his rugged exterior. As he carefully laid the young woman's body on the floor, he paused, his large hand gently closing her eyes. He then covered her with a blanket, a final act of dignity. "She deserves better than to hang here," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet filled with an undeniable resolve. He then turned his attention to the room, his gaze sharp, assessing. "This was no ordinary crime," he murmured, more to himself than to Amelia. "There's a story here. And I intend to find it." His words were a promise, a vow, and in their quiet determination, Amelia saw not just a man seeking justice, but a man burdened by a responsibility he felt compelled to shoulder. The discovery of the Apache girl's body plunged Elias into a grim, relentless investigation. The mansion, instead of a refuge, became a crime scene, a labyrinth of secrets waiting to be unearthed. He worked with a methodical intensity, his senses honed, his movements precise. He examined every inch of the grand hall, searching for clues, for any disturbance that might betray the culprit. Amelia watched him, her own grief momentarily eclipsed by the unfolding mystery. She saw a different side of Elias now, not just the silent, capable frontiersman, but a man driven by a fierce sense of justice, a quiet fury simmering beneath his stoic exterior. He found subtle marks on the polished floor, faint scuff marks near the base of the chandelier, and a single, almost invisible, silver button near the girl's body, partially obscured by dust. He picked it up with a gloved hand, his jaw tightening. "Not from her clothes," he muttered, his voice low, his eyes narrowed in thought. "A man's button." Expensive, he carefully placed it in a small leather pouch. He also noted the lack of forced entry, the absence of signs of struggle on the girl's body itself, suggesting she had been either ambushed or known her attacker. The implications were chilling. Elias then turned his attention to the girl's clothing, careful not to disturb anything. He found a small, intricately carved wooden bird tucked into a hidden pocket in her buckskin tunic. He held it in his palm, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. A gift, perhaps, he mused, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Something she valued. He carefully placed the bird back. His investigation was not just about evidence, it was about understanding the life that had been so cruelly extinguished. He moved through the mansion like a shadow, his presence felt more than heard, his mind piecing together the fragments of a brutal narrative. He spent hours in the library, poring over maps and old ledgers, searching for any record of the mansion's previous owners, any mention of local land disputes, or conflicts with the Apache tribes. He was building a picture, meticulously, patiently, of the forces that might have led to such a horrific act. Amelia, though not actively participating in his search, found herself drawn into his silent quest. She began to observe, to listen, to understand the subtle shifts in Elias's demeanor, the deepening lines around his eyes, the way his hand would instinctively go to the pistol at his hip. He was a man on a mission, and the mansion, with its dark secrets, was slowly yielding to his relentless pursuit of the truth. As Elias delved deeper into the mansion's dark history, Amelia found herself drawn into his grim pursuit of justice. She became his quiet shadow, his silent confidant, offering a steady presence in the face of the mansion's unsettling secrets. While Elias meticulously searched for clues, Amelia, with her sharper eye for domestic details, began to notice things he might overlook. She saw the faint impression of a heavy trunk having been dragged across a dusty floor in an unused servant's quarter, the lingering scent of stale pipe tobacco in the study, a single, dried rose petal pressed between the pages of a forgotten book in the library. She pointed these out to Elias, her observations quiet, unassuming, yet often providing a crucial piece to his puzzle. He, in turn, began to solicit her opinions, his gruff exterior softening just enough to acknowledge her contributions. "What do you make of this, Amelia?" he'd ask, holding up a forgotten letter, or gesturing to a peculiar stain on the wall. Their shared purpose, forged in the crucible of the mansion's dark heart, began to bridge the gap between them. They spoke more freely now, not just about the case, but about the land, about survival, about the quiet loneliness that permeated both their lives. Amelia found herself confiding in him, sharing fragments of her past, the dreams she'd once held, the crushing weight of her loss. Elias, in turn, revealed glimpses of his own life, a life lived on the fringes, driven by a desire for independence, a deep-seated distrust of authority, and a quiet respect for the land and its indigenous peoples. He spoke of his fortune, not with pride, but as a burden, a means to an end. The mansion, he explained, was purchased not for its grandeur, but for its strategic location, a place he believed could offer a measure of peace, a sanctuary from the relentless march of civilization. He had intended to create a refuge, a place where he could live on his own terms, away from the corruption and greed of the expanding settlements. The discovery of the Apache girl had shattered that illusion, transforming his intended sanctuary into a site of profound injustice. Their conversations, though often brief and punctuated by long silences, held a depth of understanding that transcended words. In the quiet hours of the night, as the wind howled outside the mansion's thick walls, they shared a silent vigil, two solitary souls bound by a shared quest for truth in a world that often seemed determined to bury it. As Elias's investigation deepened, the pieces began to fall into place, forming a grim, coherent narrative. The silver button led him to a known cattle baron, a man named Silas Blackwood, whose sprawling ranch bordered Elias's newly acquired land. Blackwood was known for his ruthless expansion, his disregard for existing land claims, and his brutal treatment of anyone who stood in his way, particularly the local Apache tribes. The dried rose petal, Amelia had discovered, was from a specific variety not native to the region, but cultivated in the small, overgrown garden behind the mansion, a garden Blackwood had once owned. The pipe tobacco scent, Elias confirmed, was a rare blend known to be favored by Blackwood. The final, damning piece of evidence came from an old, leather-bound journal Elias unearthed in a hidden compartment in the library. It was written by the mansion's previous owner, a reclusive prospector, and it detailed a series of escalating confrontations with Blackwood over water rights and territorial boundaries. The journal also contained a chilling entry, describing Blackwood's cruel disdain for the Apache, and a veiled threat against any who dared trespass on what he considered his. The journal, along with the other evidence, painted a clear picture. Blackwood had likely used the mansion as a clandestine meeting place, a base for his operations, and the Apache girl had likely stumbled upon something she shouldn't have seen. Or perhaps she was a victim of Blackwood's pervasive cruelty, a warning to her people. Elias's eyes, when he finally pieced it all together, blazed with a cold, contained fury. He used this house to commit his crimes, Elias stated, his voice low, his hands clenched into fists. And he thought he'd gotten away with it. The truth, though horrifying, brought with it a profound sense of purpose. Elias knew what he had to do. He would confront Blackwood, not with words, but with the unassailable evidence he had painstakingly gathered. Amelia, her gaze steady, met his. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet determination. She had lost so much, but in this quest for justice, she found a renewed sense of strength. She would stand by Elias, not as a helpless victim, but as a partner in their shared pursuit of truth. The mansion, once a symbol of loneliness and despair, now represented a battleground, a place where justice would finally be served. The confrontation with Silas Blackwood was inevitable, a storm brewing on the horizon. Elias, armed with the evidence and a grim resolve, rode out towards Blackwood's ranch, leaving Amelia at the mansion. He did not ask her to stay, it was an unspoken understanding, a necessity. As he rode, the silence of the plains was broken only by the rhythmic thud of his horse's hooves, each beat a drum of impending justice. He found Blackwood in his opulent study, surrounded by maps and ledgers, a cigar clutched between his teeth. The man's eyes, cold and calculating, narrowed as Elias laid out the evidence, the silver button, the journal entries, the details of the Apache girl's death. Blackwood, initially dismissive, his arrogance a shield, slowly began to unravel as Elias systematically dismantled his carefully constructed facade of respectability. The cattle baron's bluster turned to thinly veiled threats, then to a desperate, cornered rage. Elias remained calm, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering, a force of nature against Blackwood's unraveling control. The confrontation was not a physical brawl, but a battle of wills, a quiet, intense struggle for dominance, for truth. Elias, with his quiet strength and unshakable resolve, emerged victorious. Blackwood, stripped bare of his power and his reputation, was left broken, his empire teetering on the brink of collapse. Elias ensured that the full weight of the law, however slow and imperfect in the West, would fall upon Blackwood, and that the Apache community would know the truth about the girl's death and her killer. Returning to the mansion, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery hues, Elias found Amelia waiting for him. Her face, etched with worry, softened as she saw the quiet triumph in his eyes. He didn't need to speak, the truth was in his posture, in the subtle easing of his shoulders. He simply nodded, a silent affirmation of justice served. Amelia, in turn, offered a small, tentative smile, a flicker of hope in her eyes. The mansion, no longer a tomb, felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The air, once stagnant, now seemed to breathe with a quiet promise. Elias, the millionaire cowboy, had not only bought a mansion but had, in doing so, unearthed a grave injustice and brought a measure of peace to a troubled land. The mansion, no longer a monument to despair, began to breathe again. With Silas Blackwood's reign of terror brought to an end, a quiet transformation settled over the valley. Elias, true to his word, ensured that the young Apache girl received a proper burial, a ceremony attended by her people, a solemn acknowledgement of her life and the injustice of her death. He worked tirelessly to establish a dialogue with the local Apache tribes, seeking to build bridges of understanding and respect where only animosity had existed. He used his fortune, not for personal gain, but to support the community, to ensure fair trade, and to protect their ancestral lands from further encroachment. The mansion, instead of a solitary fortress, slowly began to open its doors. Amelia, no longer a lost soul, found purpose within its walls. She took on the task of restoring the house, her gentle hands bringing life back to its faded grandeur. She filled the empty rooms with light and warmth, tended the neglected garden, and slowly, painstakingly, began to transform the mansion into a home, a true sanctuary. She did not forget her son, nor the pain of her loss, but the raw edges of her grief began to soften, replaced by a quiet strength, a resilient spirit forged in hardship. She found solace in the daily rhythms of life, in the quiet companionship she shared with Elias. Their relationship, born of crisis and forged in shared purpose, deepened into a profound, unspoken bond. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic romance, but a deep, abiding respect and affection that transcended words. They were two solitary souls who had found an unexpected haven in each other, a quiet understanding that needed no embellishment. The mansion, once a symbol of a dark secret, became a beacon of hope, a place where healing could begin, where justice had been served, and where two lives, once shattered by loss and loneliness, had found a quiet, enduring peace amidst the vast, untamed beauty of the western plains. The wind still whispered through the cottonwoods, but now it carried not the lament of despair, but the soft hum of resilience, of new beginnings, and of a quiet, hard-won hope.